Welcome to the Power Platform Real-World Solution Architectures. In this session, we will look at several solutions built by customers. We'll look at those solutions from the point of view of how they were able to connect to various data sources, either by using one of the many out-of-the-box connectors or via custom connectors pointing to REST APIs. We'll look at how more complex functionality was achieved by using other building blocks available in the platform, such as Power Automate, Azure Functions, and the Power Apps components. So the most common architecture out there is really this. It's a Power Apps app or maybe a Flow or a Power BI straight away talking to the hundreds and I don't know how many right now connectors we have out of the box with the platform. So most of the time we would see apps straight using Canvas app, and then on the back end is one of those default connectors. A lot of the apps we still see are SharePoint Online apps. There's a lot of Office, connector being used, Excel as a backend, SQL. This actually dates for like this picture here dates for a year back. So probably what we see more and more is nowadays the Common Data Service connector being used more. But still, at the core of it, a lot of the successful and organic growth and the many thousands and apps that we see today are still straight UI built on Canvas and a default connector talking to a particular backend via the default infrastructure. Such an example of that is the Standard Bank. It's a bank in South of Africa. This is a success story. They had a pretty good practice around SharePoint, pre-developed practice around a lot of experience around building SharePoint in general. They needed an app that was going to use some of the native capabilities of a device. They needed to be a little bit friendly, it needed to be mobile. And it did make sense for them, given the expertise they had in SharePoint, to build this app on top of SharePoint. So they were, they released the app. They built it within a few weeks. Again, low code. It was one of their first experiences. The fact that they used SharePoint as their starting point was very helpful. Again, to start small and then develop more and more the app. So the scenario is simple. Someone goes and inspect vending machines. They see if there is any vandal, any graffitis, and they take pictures and create an issue and append those images as part of that issue or that particular request or inspection, I guess. And pre-standard, they used SharePoint to store all of their data. Again, they use the device capability that Studio gives you, like through the camera control or geolocation, and then the typical use of Flow that we also see in or Power Automate that we see in many. This is very common again. Notification, push email, push notification, email notification are usually typically done with the same fashion. An item is created somewhere, in this case in SharePoint. It's time, we know that an issue was created in the case of the ATM bank, ATM machine inspection app. So you send email notification to the people that need to act on it. So typical, again, architecture with Power Automate for notifications, very useful to do that. Canvas for good looking app, having access to camera, and then finally a Power BI that gives you an insight to all of that data. And here it's kind of all of the ATMs and kind of all of the issues that they can encounter and in a nice Power BI dashboard. One of the things that made this scenario successful for Standard Bank is also that they were, what that was going on for them is really the idea that they had a simple object model for their app. They had simple issues and images that they needed to, it's a flat table, maybe even at most 2 SharePoint lists. So they kept really their the simplicity of the scenario, plus the fact that there weren't many complex relationship between the entities. That made it that SharePoint was a good choice for them. Their expertise and the fact that they had people on board and they were staffed for, accordingly, like that also helped make this project successful. The other thing that Standard Bank were aware of, and anyone who's building apps on SharePoint know this probably very well, is that there is limitation whenever you're using SharePoint when it comes to delegated queries or queries that need to be executed server side. So for Power Apps and SharePoint connector, and specifically, if there is limitations that are well known in terms of how much data you can get. Some of the operations of filtering and search operation that you can execute on the server. Obviously, anytime you do anything on the client, it's slow. So a lot of those kind of gotchas, I guess, or things that to be aware of. Luckily, in the case of the developers of the app, they were aware of initially, or maybe they learned the hardware on, as they were building. But the fact that there is limitation in SharePoint and knowing it ahead of time, it makes you like a little bit aware of how you could architecture your app so that you don't fall into this this particular limitation of the connector. And then delegation is a topic for anyone who's going to do SharePoint apps under SharePoint, or any apps actually under any connector. There is always someone has to care about whether the data that's been requested is going to come, it's going to be able to be processed server side. And there is strategies that you can employ in the case of Standard Bank, filtering the ATM or the list of ATMs that you have access to by the user being logged in, drastically reduce the number of items that you need to sort and filter to. So there are strategies that being aware of. In this SharePoint connector world, or any connector, a default connector, will help making sure the project is successful. Again, I think the takeaway with Standard Bank is that they moved on to building many more apps on top of SharePoint, and it's pretty much a successful story. And it's there is a good chance that if you're building an app and you keep the scenario simple and you have a simple object model, that you're fine building an app on top of this connector. Again, going for Canvas app, pixel perfect app. There's a good looking app with device capabilities. Standard Bank, the only thing they needed to really make sure is that they keep their scenario simple, their object model simple, and then they could actually be successful with this app. So the connector infrastructure, just to kind of talk about, and when we talk about all of those connectors that we mentioned in the beginning, and I'll go back to this slide, and there's many, this is just a kind of a summarized version, but whenever you talk about a connector, there is a particular infrastructure behind the scene that it's good to be aware of. Again, as an app creator, you might not care about it. You're requesting your data. We want to keep it simple. You get your data back. Anything that happens behind the scene you might or might not want to care, but just for kind of being aware of it, sometimes it helps you kind of debug any performance issues that might hit your app. In the case of the Canvas app and in any standard connector we talk about, except for CDS, you have this ability, you have these layers that your request goes through. You start with the API management, you go to the connector hub, and then you finally to your data source, which can be SharePoint, can be SQL or anything like that, and then you get back your response. So we have these intermediate layers that and there is overhead each time we hop between those between these levels. That you wanna be able to kind of make sure that if you are debugging and looking at performance, that you keep this in mind, that at some point if you're not understanding really why your app is not performing, that you might need to start thinking about the next level of details for debugging, and looking at whether there is anything that's in between your app and the data source that's slowing you down. So moving on to a different scenario, again, I talked about the typical scenario, which is SharePoint plus, it stays one of the most popular way of creating apps, SharePoint plus Canvas app. But more and more, we have organizations that are investing in the common data service, that are set up to build apps, either through because they build, they have the premium licensing to go with. Those organizations that are using common data service are also able to kind of, they also have this same choice. Actually, they know you have Office 365 and SharePoint, but having common data service, you also can ask the question, which is it the right data source for me? And we see here through Belron and other customers that more and more there is reason for people to go to CDS each time their object model become more complex. In this particular case, we have few relationships that we see here that CDS does well with. So here we have the scenario here is a technical helpline app. So for technicians to kind of get some help on particular issues. They consult this app, and there is knowledge bank. So you can see here that any particular issue might be associated to a product, and then and any issue again can have multiple. Any product might have multiple knowledge banks, so knowledge bank items associated to it. So you have this notion of lookup, relationships, and many one-to-many relationships and many-to-many relationships that sometimes might be a reason to move on to an architecture where you have CDS. So the issue with connectors like SharePoint and SQL and others is that the app creator is on the hook for creating those relationships and doing joins on the client in order to pull data from different entities. That can result in degraded performance, and then it's a little bit more cumbersome from a creation, from a designing or building of the app point of view to have to deal with all of those lookups and joins and all that stuff on the client side. So CDS has this kind of thing going for it, which is really for a citizen developer like the one that created this app, Martin Lee. Was a big plus. Like he was able to kind of quickly go through a much friendly, through a friendly user interface, create an entity or several entities, connect those entities, and then and then easily through the studio understand the relationships in an object model that understand that depth and that hierarchy of or relationships between entities. So many organizations have this, not everyone have dealt with organizations that even the notion of going and creating a SharePoint list becomes unmanageable. How to kind of keep track of what SharePoint lists are used and how to organize, or how to kind of scale basically the usage of those data or those entities when you are talking about SharePoint list becomes kind of cumbersome for an organization. So CDS kind of help with that, since again you have these notions of model that we'll talk about. Again, just take away here is that CDS, another connector, if licensing is not an issue, common data service, again, gives you the, not only what I'm mentioning right now, we'll see more scenarios where CDS and the platform, generally give you a lot more options when you are licensed as well for that. But if you are given a choice, object model, SharePoint list, the data is understood, there is no delegation issues. SharePoint is a pretty powerful data source. I think the next step obviously is common data service. Some organization has the convenience of letting their citizen develop, wanting the convenience of having their citizen developer create common data service or create entities or databases themselves. The whole notion of serve-serves, serve-serve activity through like a much better kind of experience within the designer dealing with CDS in general. So those are kind of reasons why CDS becomes another attractive options if SharePoint is if that's an option at all as well. In the case of these particular scenarios, again, we see the typical flow uses for notifications, very common pattern again, dashboards from Power BI, and more we get that Microsoft integration, team integration, that makes it a lot more convenient for organizations that are already heavy on Teams to find a single place, an entry point for that particular Power apps. And then so we'll see that this is becoming again more and more desirable to go and integrate with Teams. Okay, just one thing to note about the CDS connector, the most recent implementation of it got rid of those layers, the APM management and the connector hub. And as a result, when you do a request using CDS, it goes straight away to the common data service backend. So eliminating that overhead and making use of that rich API that CDS has already. So again, for someone who is looking for a boost in performance, that's another reason CDS might be a good option. Another example that we could talk about is really that notion of going a little bit, you get into scenarios where maybe 100%, 90% of it is something achievable within the platform, but you need to step in into a pro dev kind of, or use a bit of the additional functionality that you have available to the platform to extend the capabilities. So in this particular case, Metrobank wanted to create a greeting app. So this is something that needed to look great when customers showed up into a branch. Again, very simple app. You get a customer, you link or you tie or you connect that customer with an available teller or banker, depending on some of the criterias, and then all of this customer information is actually already available in your CDS, or in their case was a dynamic instance. And the great thing here is that this app was supposed to kind of have the customer set expectations, send them a text message when the next teller is available, and do some calculations to go and give you an estimate of how long that wait time will be. Here again, the complexity of that particular function made it such that an Azure function was desirable, or a function or a server-side processing of that, was required. So that's something also to keep in mind when you're building. And we see that in many customer interactions. The more complexity you see in the algorithm or the logic that you want to imply, and if you start seeing that within your Canvas app, you have to wonder whether that's the appropriate place for it. So we've seen successful project or less successful project that made their apps more complex, and it would have been much easier to kind of move some of that functionality into a server-side function. Azure is a nice extension, or a nice way of extending or moving some of the complexity back in the back end. Here, they wrote an Azure function to calculate the wait time. Again, it's serverless kind of, it allowed them to scale, not have to worry about maintaining in all of that infrastructure. They needed to have an Azure function subscription. They needed someone to build the Azure function, but 90% of the app or 99% of the app was a pure Canvas app. So the takeaway here is that, again, we see, again, more and more, or we see a lot of this hybrid where most of the app is built in Canvas, and then there is an additional complex logic that needs to be written, and that's moved server side. In this case, it's an Azure function, but it could be a full-on web layer through REST APIs or whatever. There is more and more integration with Azure in order to kind of make this operation seamless. Here is just a screenshot of how kind of the Azure function would have been kind of built, but also this nice kind of button here that allow you to export the API or the Swagger file or API definition and automatically create a custom connector, which is the means by which Power Apps will talk to an Azure function. We'll talk more about customer connector in a bit. All right, so again, just mentioning here the fact that there is nice integration with Azure, and then again, the idea of moving complexity. Each time you see that your app is becoming complex from a client-side perspective, from Power Apps, you should have to think whether it's worth moving to a backend, that whether that's Azure or something else. But again, given that Power Apps is a that layer is great for UI, but as soon as, and given the fact that the language is pretty simple and rudimentary, sometimes it's more appropriate to have complex scenarios or complex logic moved to the server. I'll continue here. This is another example of apps that were. The scenario here is all of the Microsoft. Microsoft wanted to ship employee engagement apps, I guess, things like that allow employee to enter their vacation, know what the holidays are. There's this Kudos app that allow you to kind of congratulate other colleagues. It's a whole set of apps that were built for 100,000 plus employees. In this particular case, there was many reasons to kind of build, to use Power Apps itself, the Canvas app as a UI layer, but use existing REST APIs and existing infrastructure that already existed for web pages and kind of legacy system that already were using that same backend. So it made sense for in such case to kind of just simply expose existing endpoints via custom connectors and allow folks actually from the HR department, PMs that were more citizen developer kind of that understood kind of what the experience needed to be, what the user engagement needed to be, build the app. So in this case was a nice partnership between IT that took care of all of the core infrastructure of exposing those API functions, so this partnership between IT and HR that represented really that understood very well what the user needed. A successful operation there. The tried set of apps are still used today. I usually enter my vacation through those apps. There's another reason why, so this is kind of a high-level architecture view of all of those apps. You can see here, we had existing kind of APIs that managed people, like this is just kind of, all of the user base that Microsoft employees, calendar, app services. This is the card services. We'll talk about it in a second. Push notification again was used through Flow, but again, typical. All of those things already existed or was pretty much needed few tweaks in order to expose via custom connector, and simply the UI Canvas was used as a UI layer. Again, when you use Power Apps plus a connector, a default connector like SharePoint or CDS, you're really like, you don't have to worry about all of that backend or all of that infrastructure, and you don't have to host it. You don't have to, the whole cost of that. But then in reality today, even with what we have out of the box with Power Apps, when you are building an infrastructure like this, where you have a proper web layer, a REST API, and a backend, you really have the best of all of the worlds, because you have control, full control of how you want to shape your data or your response to the server. So you can really, you don't have to worry about relationships and joins and all that stuff. You can do advanced stuff like caching data on, smart things to kind of boost optimization. You could join and mix a bunch of responses so that you don't have to do back and forth between the client and the server. So there is a lot of advantages in having an architecture that relies on a web layer. It comes at a heavy cost of having to develop it and maintain it, and extending the time frame by which you execute on a project. But still, there are there is a situation where the best advice you would give to a customer is to not, especially if you're dealing with 10, 15 tables or entities, and you really need data from all of those entities, and maybe views is not the way you want to do, and we'll talk about that in a second, views. But again, having to do all of that orchestration client side is not the most optimal way. And at that point, it becomes actually the best recommendation is to tell the customer you have to invest in actually a proper REST API and a custom connector to kind of, and have Power Apps to just use the use Power Apps as a UI layer, which is still going to give you a lot of advantages. I mean, you're going to be able to rapidly develop your UI. But again, yes, it happened to me to kind of give the advice that, given your scenario, the complexity of your user, of your logic, and maybe the number of entities and sources that you need to use, makes it that it's better to kind of go and build your own web layer. As an example of that, where that is clear, one of the apps that came with this suite of apps is this feed app, and the feed needed to merge data from multiple sources. Like there is news, there is cards, notion of cards, like you could actually approve, reject cards. And the source of news, this data card, the sources came from multiple places. So this is an example where if you were dealing with just straight default connectors and multiple entities that might have lived in SharePoint or CDS, and having to kind of mix all of this data into one single view, and then presenting it, and doing it client side purely in Power Apps would have meant that the experience would have suffered greatly from a performance perspective. So in this cases, you might end up having to build that web REST API that does the job of intelligently mix the data from multiple sources and just give you one feed view, one view over all of the data that you need. So this is just a kind of a high-level view of the custom connector. We talked about custom connector infrastructure. Again, there's few options here when you're talking about custom connectors. There is custom connector that allow you to kind of, at the end of the day, they are always kind of linked to a REST API. You might hear sometimes this codeless custom connector, which basically means that you didn't develop a REST API. You just connected to an existing API. Like we'll talk about a project soon with T-Mobile, which basically we created a custom connector to basically talk to CDS, which is just a REST API that's available for us. But anyway, so that's kind of the custom infrastructure. One thing to note, and it's not necessarily an architectural, it could, Components were something that's more recent, and then in the recent iteration of some of those employee apps, we used shared common components, and we see this more and more with customers. The idea of building components in order to streamline and make sure that actually these apps are consistent from a look. And also to speed up development, components, more and more components are used as a way to kind of build apps. In fact, we see example of apps where most of the app is actually components that are linked together through the input-output properties that are exposed via components. In the native in this HR apps, they built a bunch of components that ended up being very, very useful to kind of keep those apps consistent and move a bit quickly. Along the same line, components can be used for distribution to basically help a team distribute development across developers. So there is a blog post around this. I'll paste some of the resources that you could go check out. But components are a pretty good way of making sure that multiple developers are involved in the same project. And again, this is new to some extent, because components just recently went into preview, went out of preview into GA, and basically, but again, I'm starting to see more and more customers using components as a way to go and have developers across the team build specific components and have a story around integrating those components. This is just an example of how there is this master app and there is shared components that someone is working on that are being integrated as they're changing. There is custom components that come back and get integrated as part of the main app. So there is that main app, the master app, again, only one developer can use at a time. But all of those components, if their handshake is well understood, how they interact between each other, you can easily go and offload that work and then have this main app just basically be a kind of an app that integrates all of those components and stitch them together. So another example of more advanced CDS and project here, Common Data Service was needed not only because it made life a bit easier. The first iteration of this project used SQL and wasn't successful because the requirement of the project had very kind of I mean, this app was meant for executives to check all of the initiatives that are, or any customer facing project, anything that touch customers, this app needed to manage. So a project or initiative gets created in this tool, and then later on execs had a view over the different stages an app project was in. They could approve or reject that particular stage. But that first iteration using SQL couldn't properly do, didn't, I mean, because of the connector and again, some of the plus of the Common Data Services have an advanced security model that allow you to kind of really fine tune and organize and create a security hierarchy that fits your need. And again, trying to do it in a different connector like SQL was a nightmare because you needed to do all sorts of checks client side of who is logged in. It wasn't secure. You could always or find out, by looking at the fielder traces or whatever, have access to the tables, and it was hard to secure. Also, because it was using SQL, we couldn't leverage some of the out-of-the-box functionality like business process flow, which is project needed in order to move between stages. So again, this is an example where, because of the complexity of SQL, the requirement when it, needing a security model that was advanced, like an efficient kind of data store, and CDS made sense. The need for views, which CDS allow you to do, configuring views server side, was something that was needed in order to kind of show all of those list views, the view of all of the projects. You needed to kind of have particular look at those depending on who was logged in. So the business process flow is another big component that was needed here. Business process flow, and I don't know if I have a picture of that here, but by default, for those who use business process flow, this is this technology that allows you to create complex kind of business process flow. You can do branching. You have an ability to create stages and have users enter different field before and completing those fields before moving to a different stage. All of that infrastructure exists in the platform. In the T-Mobile case, they needed to have that view within a Power Apps Canvas app. So that was the challenge. In their first iteration with SQL, they actually built everything from scratch to kind of manage and orchestrate project going between stages. Their motivation for moving to CDS was also to be able to leverage BPF, business process flow, out, the out-of-the-box technology that exists. What was missing, again, is a Canvas component that worked within Canvas. And luckily, because of the use of custom connector, we were able to go and interrogate CDS APIs that gave you insight about all of the information needed around your business process flow. So looking at this architecture, and I'll explain a little bit more, an interesting use of flow as well. But again, so this is a regular business process flow. They created all of the stages in low code in a designer for business process flows. And this designer is friendly. Again, there's no code into it, and allow them to create the stages and change them as they change their mind, or as new stages or new functionality or new requirement happen with respect to the stages. So because this BPF was created and we had available APIs out of the box, we were able to expose those through custom all of those APIs to a custom connector. And when I talk about those APIs are simply things like get me all of the stages of a business process flow, give me the active stage of a business process flow, or set the active stage to the next stage, or whatever. I'm simplifying. And we were able to create a custom connector to do this, but we also used so the app used flow in a different fashion than usual. Usually we use notification. Flow has multiple users, but in more and more I see people using Power Apps, Power Automate as a kind of a backend layer to do more advanced operation. That needs to return response back to Power Apps. So it's not just the typical Power Automate flow that goes and executes something on the server and does something out of the bound. This is really like Power Apps asking for some information, and Power Automate via a flow goes and retrieves the data. Maybe in the case of this particular project, we needed to shape the response in such a way that it's more convenient to consume in Power Apps. So today, another weakness, if you want, I would say weakness, but depends how you want to see it. But a weakness on the client side on Power Apps is that if you do get entity data from multiple sources or from one source, but you want to shape it in such a way that it becomes easy to render in a UI in the UI in a specific way. It's hard to do this manipulation. And this a very simple example. In this particular project, I needed, what needed to happen really is an indexing of each of the stages. The CDS API returned all of the stages, but we needed to append an index to each one of the stages so that it's easy to go between stages. It's a convenience. Basically, we needed to add an additional property to a response. Doing it client side is a bit more complex and makes the code a little bit hard to maintain and longer than it needs to. So Power, rather than building a web layer and a REST API in a pro dev fashion, you could use, and what they did here is they used Power Automate to shape that data in such a way and basically do all of that manipulation server side. And then anyway, so it's a substitute to a full-on backend. Sometimes is what I'm referring to. Power Automate can help do that for you. So especially when you need to change a response or do something more complex to that API. And that's what happened with some of the responses that were coming from the native CDS APIs. They were just too complex, too deep in the object model. We needed to simplify them to make them more convenient to work within the Canvas app. So Flow was used to that. And again, for many of the operation, we're using the straight connection to Power Apps, to CDS, to get all of the typical CRUD operations coming from there. And again, another interesting use of Power Automate here is this notion of going between stages. So this is an early iteration of the project. You could notice here that every stage here, there are approvers that needed to approve that particular stage before you move on to the next stage. So approval in that case could be used for such an operation. In this particular case, you could imagine this is a very summarized version of the actual very complex flow that was used. But the idea is that here, we moved on to another stage. We get all of the users for that are linked to a particular stage. We create an approval for that stage. We wait for that stage to finish. We go ahead and actually get the active path or the active, all of the active stages that are out there, and we can move on to the next stage. So basically, a user comes here. As soon as we move on to one stage, what happens behind the scenes is a flow gets created, gets triggered. It goes and actually creates an approval. And then wait for that approval to be done before actually automatically move you to the next stage, at which, tree point, the same operation happens again. An approval is created. We wait for all of the users to approve before moving on. Again, the takeaway here is that there is a rich set of APIs. The platform, especially when we talk about CDS, you're automatically going into a lot more. You have a bit more tools in your disposals, depending on the project. If there is like strict security or complex security need or for the project, default connectors like SQL or SharePoint might not do it. In some situation, you want to make use of business process flow or maybe some more advanced capabilities of the platform. CDS might be the right choice for those situations. One thing to keep in mind is that there is a delay. Shami used Power Automate as a backend. It's very convenient. You didn't jump into code. You don't have to host any web API and manage it and pay for the hosting and all that stuff. But there is a bit of looking at the debugging tool. There is a bit of an overhead when you call custom connector straight, or even a native API connector, CDS connector straight, versus versus going through a Power Automate, there is a bit of an overhead with that. So, you know, you have to be able to live with that. It looked like more 40%, 50%, you know, additional overhead in getting back a response if you're doing the Power Automate. This is another scenario of HSBC building both a model-driven app and a Canvas app. And let me just they needed a very friendly, and the whole scenario is actually, you know, pretty easy. It's a compliance app. They need to go through a certain number of steps, and at the end of that steps, they get a green light or red light. You know, it's a compliance app. You know, the app itself is used. The Canvas app is used for the relationship managers out there in the field. It needed to be streamlined, nice, you know, looking app, focused app. And they used a Canvas app for that. They also needed to enter all of the compliance, model-driven app, all of the compliance data. You know, they had some potentially the complexity of those. They used model-driven app because it had the strength of nice validation, you know, business process flows if they needed to. But they could quickly build those model-driven apps so that the admins, the backend office, can actually add those compliance items entries. So that app didn't need to have the whistles and the look and feel that the Canvas app had. But overall, you know, we see again the same pattern with many of our customers, T-Mobile included. Some of the high level, you know, execs in the T-Mobile case needed a branded experience. Here, it's the same thing. The app itself needed to be a certain look. So Canvas app is used. Model-driven apps was just for the backend. More and more that pattern is used, and that's kind of again, the takeaway: pixel perfect, task oriented is Canvas app. You know, very custom user experience, and then anything has to do with basically data entry and data over form over data. All of that stuff is model driven and excel at. Those lines are going to be blurred as we have this notion of pages, and as we merge the platform, all of this kind of will become irrelevant. But for now, this is what it is. There is some strength of each of the two frameworks, if you want, and then play into the strength of each when you're knowing the strengths is good ahead of time. Actually, speaking of that, is a good example. The offline scenario that was needed for this particular scenario. It's an inspection app. They go on site. They might or might not have online capability connection. They needed offline capabilities. It was a Power Apps Canvas shop initially. Their need, luckily, here was pretty simple. They were able to use the basic functionality that comes out of the box with Power Apps Canvas to build that offline capability. This is kind of a summary of some of the building blocks that are available. And this is something to keep in mind again. If you have a complex requirement from a customer for offline, deep relationship between entities, new items, you have to keep in mind that what Power Apps Canvas gives you is just load data, save data, this ability to check whether you have a connection or not. So it's a very rudimentary, a very simple function, rudimentary functions that allow you to orchestrate the loading and saving data into local stores of the device. So being aware of that helps you kind of decide from the get-go whether maybe Canvas is appropriate technology for this. Offline in model-driven app is more, is automatic. You could, you don't have to worry about, conflict resolution. So doing all of those operation in Canvas is hard. Conflict resolution, syncing, all of that is doable, but it's error prone because you are on your own doing it. Again, successful project for Kelly Roofing with this particular inspection app because their scenario was scoped properly. and they understood the kind of the limitation of the platform, even in terms of how much data they can save and into the device. And then also understanding that they don't have to worry about complex things like syncing and synchronization and conflict resolution of items that can be created in multiple devices offline. So SQL is also one of very successful, or I guess up until recently, I guess until the the recent licensing changes, SQL was a very popular backend after SharePoint, because again you had a little bit more options for scaling. A lot of our customers had already data in their SQL databases, so it made sense to just keep it in SQL. So Pepsi, J&J Pepsi had such a scenario where they wanted a merchandise app. This app again needed data, like basically needed access to existing merchandise data that existed in a SQL database that was an on-premise database. So they used gateways. So they used gateways as a way to get to their on-premise data that was on SQL. The SQL again was typically a popular backend, just because also it had things like ability to kind of define views, SQL views. So SQL views were pretty nice to have for things that you needed to kind of do complex joins and stuff like that from a server side perspective. And avoids doing joins and stuff on the client side. So was a attractive way of kind of data source for a while. In the case of J&J Pepsi, they didn't have the same security requirements anyway that were in CDS, that are available in CDS, and plus they were already tied to that backend because back then their data used to be in SQL. So one thing with SQL that gateways, and there is a bunch of documentation on really white papers on gateways, and you could I'll put some links later on. But there is an additional again, because we're using SQL, it's a default connector, so we have that APM management connector overhead. But on top of that, we need to make sure that you have that additional potential bottleneck of data gateways that someone has to be aware of, because you could actually get really poor performances if your gateway is a bottleneck, especially if you have many things coming through that gateways. You have to be kind of mindful of the fact that by the time you get back a response to your client out there on the web, it's gonna take a while. It could take a while if this is not properly scaled. Okay, that was SQL. Again, SQL view. Sorry, I didn't talk about explicit column selection that we see in CDS and on SQL. Those are really cool features that you see in the app settings. That again made this SQL connector a good connector to use. Is this explicit column selection that automatically knew which columns of your particular table was used within your app, and automatically brought that data back to the client. So when you make a request to get data from a server from SQL, if a particular column is not used or viewed within the UI, is not in the UI, it's not brought back to the client, which ended up really reducing drastically the number of the data size that's coming back through the wire. So Leonard Cheshire here, it's a managing healthcare app. I think this is another scenario that's rich in the sense that it's using a lot of the aspect of the platform in a nice way, and I'll briefly discuss some of them here. So basically, they built a bunch of apps. I mean, one of the most notable thing they kind of used is this idea of embedded Canvas app within model-driven apps. So they had particular scenario, and this is just one example of many apps where they used Canvas app to have a richer experience. They needed images. They might have needed a better look at access to different data sources. So they used a nice integration here of model-driven apps, of Canvas app within model-driven apps. They also use the health accelerator. So for those, those are nice things to get started if you are in the healthcare or some of those industry pillars that have an accelerator. They allow you to install, automatically when you get this accelerator, you install entities that are typical for that particular industry. So the healthcare accelerator had a bunch of things about patient, doctor, a bunch of entities that, as someone who's building this app, I don't have to worry about generalizing that schema or having the right schema. You get something to start with. So the accelerator here was a nice use of the technology here to get started and have the right entities to begin with. They also had data in finance and operations, so they needed to retrieve that data back into, it will bring that data back into CDS for usage. So for those who are familiar with finance and operations, it's not built on CDS. So if you have data there and you want to use all of the kind of, like you want to build a model-driven app or a nice Canvas app, it is really convenient to bring that data back to CDS, and then use that. So data integration is the feature that they use to bring that data in this case, and allow you to schedule those, retrieval of data, and it's one way from the source to destination. In their case, there is many ways to get data out of finance and operation. There's a connector as well they could have used whenever they're using Canvas app, but since they were building also model-driven apps, bringing data to CDS made sense for them. They could also have I think they evaluated that, or they might have gone with that if the technology was available at the time. It's this whole dual write technology that's already also available for people that want to bring data from finance and operation into Dynamics, into CDS. So this is a more sophisticated thing, kind of technology where it's not just a one-way direction where you sync data into CDS, but if you write something from within your model-driven app or from your Canvas, it actually makes it back into the finance and operation database as well. Anyway, I'm mentioning this stuff again just so that you keep in mind that there is a lot of abilities in the platform. That's there's a lot of features and stuff that are being used in many interesting ways. Here's another example of a Power BI, a Power Apps integrated in Power BI. Fortunately, I don't have better screenshots, but this is a Power BI report, and this is an HR employee app. They needed additional information from employees, and there was a bunch of data already available and rendered within the report. So embedding their Power App within their Power BI report made sense so that they can actually act on that data right away. Again, they are using the same pattern that you see in SharePoint integration or team integration. There is this object here, Power BI integration. If you are doing an embedded SharePoint, you will find SharePoint integration object. This object, depending on what you're building, or the technology will have some functions exposed. In the case of Power BI, it exposes some nice functionality. Like first of all, it exposes data that represents the selected or the context from Power BI, so that if you want to render something within Power BI, within Power Apps that understands the data that you're looking at from Power BI, you could do that. And also, if you do change data or persist new data, you have ability to refresh the actual Power BI visuals as well. So this is another kind of a Contoso. I can't use the customer name here, but again, it's a large oil company in Canada. They had a specific requirement around endangered species of plants. So they need to clean up basically their pipelines. But before they can clean up plants around their pipeline, they need to make sure that they are not destroying plants that are endangered or that are poisonous. Anyway, there were requirements around what they can clean up or what they can't clean up. So they would take pictures of those plants, and they would send them for analysis through Vision APIs that's available with Azure. And then they would sign. Let me move on to this. So they would upload their data to blob storage via the Azure connector. Their actual data around a particular sighting of a plant is in SharePoint. The Azure, recognition or basically Vision APIs were used here through a custom Azure function. They had notifications, they had tickets that were created when they needed to in Dynamics, and they had a Power BI to kind of see where things are, as typically is the case for this project. Again, here, I think the kind of the thing that, sorry, this wasn't supposed to be here. The typical thing that we see again here is that there is a lot of Azure functionality that's out of the box that someone needs to look at before starting building on their own. Like the whole blob storage connector. There's I think around 20 or 30 Azure connectors out of the box that allow you to do all sorts of things with Azure. And that's something that shops that that are already invested in the Azure platform use more and more. It's just like all of this basic investment they have in Azure through Power Apps, and basically this is an example of that. So the other thing that's new, I guess, since this is just that there is also AI Builder. So again, before if someone has kind of a requirement from a customer and they need to go and build an app that has need for some sort of like Vision API or some sort of AI in general, looking at what the capabilities of AI Builder becomes the first thing. Looking at the default connectors that connects to all of the APIs, the AI from Azure or all of the Azure entities is also another good thing to do, just so that you don't reinvent the wheel. And especially if you're using a default connector, again, it's probably the most optimal way to get things done faster. But again, this is just an example of how multiple aspects in tandem to kind of create a more complex solution. This is a board app. I think it's another example of a Canvas app, but the goal here was to see how we can integrate with other aspects and have like kind of a unified way for someone to look at data, whether they are in Outlook or Teams or technology, without much customization, out of the box things that allowed us to kind of make an app of this complexity. So the main piece of technology here was this server-side sync that allow you to sync appointments between, or your calendar between Exchange and the appointment or meeting entity in Common Data Service. There was need here to kind of talk to the document library for SPO to store all of the document that the board member needed to access to. There are specific permissions, again, complex permissions, that a certain set of people needed to have access to certain documents and a view of the data. But anyway, the main point again here is that there is the server-side technology, and that allow you to kind of unify a bit the kind of the view over your data, whether you're looking at it from Office or from the Canvas app side of things. And then finally, I think another pattern we see is is the use of PCF components to extend again what can be done within model-driven apps and Canvas app. So this is Chevron. They have a complex drilling app that that required, like, every field here has like very strong, very complex calculation that's happened in order to kind of come up with a certain number. They wanted to make sure that they have a good idea about how they arrive to certain numbers. So it's a very custom scenario here that allowed them to not only trace kind of all of the variable used to kind of accomplish a certain calculation, they needed to see kind of what that formula looked like. Things change over time. So anyway, they built a PCF component again, to a complex PCF component to serve their need. And this is just an example of how they extended the platform to kind of achieve specific goal again that they had in mind, in order to be successful in the implementation. So PCF, we talked about common data, the components as a way, the Canvas component that were used for the HR app. This is a pro dev framework using HTML, JavaScript, and the typical web technologies to kind of build more complex components that can go into a model-driven app or a Canvas component or a Canvas app. So again, more and more we see the PC as this stuff become available, we see it as another arm or tool in your arsenal that allow you to kind of accomplish your goals. And again, up until recently, especially in the Canvas world, we had limitations that were not necessarily solved by a web, were not solved server side. We needed to build specific UI component that couldn't be built within the Canvas framework. More and more, PCF becomes the answer for such, unique requirements. Personally, it's rare that I see, particular UI component not achievable in Canvas app. But again, if you have customers that have unique, requirements, some sort of like, I don't know, transitioning animation or some access to hardware capability that is not available from the default components of Studio, then PCF might become your way of achieving your goals. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed the session, and see you soon.